By the time Director Yvonne Serrano reached the ambulance bay at Northline General, the freezing fog had turned the lot lights into 57 small white smears. And inside the building, there were 57 people who should not have been alive, and every one of them was still breathing. She walked into a hallway of staff too spent to lift their heads and asked the only question worth asking. Who ran this? For 11 seconds, nobody said anything at all. Then the man who had pulled the badge off a nurse's scrubs that afternoon and watched security walk her out through those same doors said her name out loud himself, and his voice did not sound like it belonged to him anymore. If you're new here, this is the kind of story this channel exists for. Quiet people, real pressure, and the moment the room finally figures out who was holding it up. Subscribing costs you 1 second and keeps these coming. Nora Halverson had worked the emergency department at Northline General for 12 years, and in all that time, the staff had learned exactly 2 things about her, both of them wrong. The first was that she was cold. She wasn't. She just didn't spend words she didn't have a use for, and in a building where people talked constantly to keep the fear at a distance, silence read as temperature. The second was that she had no ambition. That one had hardened into fact somewhere around her 5th year, when she turned down the charge nurse position for the 3rd time and stopped being asked. People assumed she'd hit her ceiling and made peace with it. It never occurred to any of them that a person could look at a ceiling, understand precisely what was above it, and decide the view wasn't worth what it cost. She worked nights mostly. Brightwater, Oregon sat in a bowl of coastal hills that filled with fog for 4 months out of the year, and the department in February had a specific rhythm to it. Slow and gray until it wasn't. She liked the quiet stretches. She used them the way other people used coffee. There were habits she had that the staff noticed without ever assembling into a picture. She never sat with her back to a door. In the break room, there were 6 chairs, and Nora used exactly one of them, the one wedged in the corner with the wall behind it, and the hallway in her sight line. And if somebody else got there first, she stood. She stood the whole break. Teddy Okafor, 24 and 11 weeks out of orientation, once offered her his seat, and she told him no thanks, in a way that closed the subject so completely he never asked again. She always turned her right ear toward whoever was talking. Slightly. A quarter turn of the head that people read as intensity, as if she were leaning into their words. Nobody knew that her left ear had been finished 8 years ago, and that everything on that side arrived as a high, thin tone that never stopped and never had a sound, like a wire drawn tight somewhere behind her jaw. She had learned to build a room out of one ear, the way other people learn to drive. It took about a year. After that, it was just how she moved. She touched patients before she looked at their numbers. Always. Hand to the sternum fingers, to the wrist, the back of 2 knuckles laid against the skin above the collarbone for 1 full second. Residents found it charming and old-fashioned. One of them called it bedside intuition once at a debrief, and Nora let it go, because correcting him would have required explaining that intuition had nothing to do with it, that what she was doing was reading the specific way. Heat leaves a body, whether it was pulling back evenly from the surface or retreating inward from the fingertips, like a tide going out, and that she had learned the difference in a place where there had been nothing to read a body with except her hands. There was a coin in the right hip pocket of her scrubs, brass worn thin at the edge from 12 years of a thumb moving across it in the same arc. She didn't think about it. Her hand went to it when she was working a problem the way another person's hand goes to a pen. If you had asked her about it, she would have said it was a keychain thing, and she would have said it flat enough that you'd move on. Dr. Roland Pike came to Northline 18 months before this story starts, and he came with a mandate. He was 46 sharp, and not a bad clinician. That's the part people got wrong about him later, when it was easier to make him simple. Pike could read a CT better than anyone in the building, and he had never once been rude to a patient's family. What he had, instead of cruelty, was a conviction, and the conviction was this. Medicine had spent a century running on the gut feelings of people who were wrong more often than they admitted, and the fix was measurement. Score everything. Track everything. Put the algorithm between the patient and the human error, and watch the mortality numbers come down. The thing is, he was right. That was what made him dangerous. The scoring systems he brought in did catch things. The sepsis alert had pulled 2 people off the edge in his first 6 months, and everyone knew it. Pike had watched the data prove him correct over and over in a way that felt like the universe agreeing with him. And somewhere in there, he'd stopped being able to tell the difference between trusting the numbers and needing the numbers to be the only thing that counted. Because if a nurse's hand could know something the screen didn't, then the screen wasn't the floor of the building. It was just another opinion, with better graphics. And Pike had built his entire self on the screen being the floor. He and Nora had been circling each other for a year and a half. It was never loud. She'd flag something he'd point at a score, she'd say, "All right," and go do her job. And about a third of the time she turned out to have been seeing something he wasn't. He never acknowledged those, not out of spite. He genuinely filed them as noise because a person who is right by feel 3 times out of 10 is statistically a coin flip with a good story about itself. That's what he actually believed. It was reasonable. It was also in a very specific way blind. The first Tuesday of February at 4 in the morning, he made it public for the first time. Nora had moved a patient. A woman in her 60s hip pain after a fall scored low across the board, sitting in the waiting room in position 11 with an expected wait of 3 hours. Nora walked past her with an armload of linens, stopped, came back and put 2 knuckles against the woman's collarbone. Then she took her to Bay 3 and started a line and called for labs before anyone had authorized any of it. The woman was bleeding into her retroperitoneum. She went to interventional radiology at 5:15, and she went home 9 days later. At 6:20, with the shift change crowd assembling, and Teddy Okafor standing 3 feet away with a stack of charts, Pike called Nora over to the wall monitor and turned the screen toward her. He wasn't shouting. He never shouted. He put his finger on the triage score on the row where the system had placed that woman, and he asked her what number she was looking at. Nora looked at the number. He asked her what her authority was to override a validated tool, and then he answered it himself before she could, which was the whole point of the exercise. Her authority was a feeling, and feelings, he said, are how departments end up in front of a review board, explaining why the patient nobody scored properly was the one who coded. Nora said the woman was bleeding. Pike said that was the outcome, not the reasoning, and that if she couldn't tell the difference between those 2 things, then she had just made his case for him. There was a version of this conversation where Nora explained the difference between skin that is cool and skin that is cool in a specific pattern, and the way that pattern had looked at 4 in the morning under a fluorescent light in a waiting room. She could have said it in 20 seconds. She didn't. She had learned a long time ago what happens when a person with a system is handed information from outside the system in front of an audience. It doesn't get evaluated. It gets defended against. So she said, "Understood." She said it in the flat voice, and she went back to work, and the crowd at the desk went back to their handoffs, and Teddy Okafor stood there with his charts and a look on his face, like he'd just watched something happen that he didn't have a name for yet. Nora's thumb found the coin in her pocket and moved across the worn edge once and let go. 9 days later, a man named Delroy Kemp came in with a scraped knee. Before Delroy Kemp, though, there was the week in between, and the week in between had Walt Becker in it. Walt was 74, and he came to the emergency department the way some people come to a diner, regularly on a loose schedule expecting the same faces. His chart was a brick. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, hard-earned across 4 decades of breathing rock dust, plus a heart that had been patched twice and resented it. He'd worked demolition and tunnel blasting his whole life, and the last big job on his record was the one everybody in Brightwater knew, even if they'd never met him, because he'd been the lead powder man on the Route 9 tunnel, the 2-mile bore through Halloran Ridge that had cut 40 minutes off the coast road and put the town on a map it hadn't been on before. Now he came in twice a month, with his oxygen saturation in the low 80s, wheezing like a bellows with a hole in it, and most of the staff had long since filed him under frequent flyer, which is the gentlest of the cruel words a hospital has for the people it sees too often. The phrase does a specific kind of damage. It tells everyone in earshot that this person's emergency is not really an emergency, that they are a draw on resources rather than a reason for them, and it gives the staff permission to feel their own compassion drain out without guilt, because the system has already labeled the tank as leaky. Nora didn't use the phrase, not out of sentiment. She just found it inaccurate, and inaccuracy bothered her more than most things. A man whose lungs were failing was not less of an emergency because his lungs failed on a predictable timetable. He was a slower emergency. That was all. She was also the only one who talked to him about the tunnel. The others treated the tunnel as a fact on his intake, if they noticed it at all. Nora treated it as the most interesting thing about the most interesting man in the room. She asked him about ventilation shafts and blast sequencing and the specific problem of a ridge that turned out to have more water in it than the survey promised. Walt would answer between labored breaths in the short, clipped sentences of a man rationing air, and something in him straightened a little every time, because being asked a real question about the best work of your life is a kind of medicine. No formulary carries. He told her once that the whole job came down to one thing. You never trusted the rock you could see. You trusted the rock you could feel through the drill, the way the bit grabbed or slid, the way the whole rig hummed different when you were about to hit a seam of something that would kill you. The survey was the score, he said, not knowing he was saying anything about her at all. The drill was the truth. Nora didn't tell him he'd just described her entire life. She just said that sounded about right, and turned his flow rate up a notch and moved on. The mini-reveal that week was a man named Osei. He came in at 2 in the morning with what the triage note called a probable tension headache worst of his life, and a score that put him comfortably in the middle of the queue. He was 38, and he was talking, and his vitals were unremarkable, and by every metric the department ran on. He was a man who would sit for 2 hours and then get some fluids and a dark room and go home. Nora was walking past with a warm blanket for someone else when she heard him talk. That was all. He was answering a question from his wife, something ordinary, and one word in the middle of the sentence came out with the wrong stress on it. Not slurred, not dropped. Just landed a half-beat late the way a stair does when the last step is a different height than your foot expected. She put the blanket down. She stood in front of Osei and asked him 3 quick questions that had nothing to do with a headache, and watched his eyes as much as she listened to his answers. And she saw the thing she was checking for the very slight lag in the left side of his face. When he did what she asked, a lag so small that a person not looking for it would file it under tired. She didn't announce anything. She found the resident on shift, a young woman named Pham, who was capable and overworked, and she told her quietly that Osei's word-finding felt off to her, and asked if Pham would mind eyeballing him for a posterior circulation problem before he sat any longer. She framed it as a favor. She framed it so that if Pham walked over there and found nothing, it cost Pham nothing. And if Pham walked over there and found something, it was Pham who found it. Pham walked over there and found something. The scan lit up a clot in the basilar artery, the kind that doesn't announce itself with a dramatic collapse, the kind that just quietly closes a door in the back of the brain and locks it. Osei went to the cath lab. The team pulled the clot. He was talking normally by morning, and he never knew that the reason his face still worked was a nurse who happened to hear one word land wrong on her way to somewhere else. By the time the good news came back down, Nora was 2 rooms away restarting an IV and had said nothing to anyone. Pham got the thank you from the family. Pham deserved part of it, and Nora had engineered it, so Pham would get all of it, because that was the arrangement Nora preferred. Credit was a liability. Credit made people watch you, weigh you, expect from you, and eventually resent you. Anonymity let her work. Teddy Okafor saw it, though. Teddy was new enough that he still watched everything the way you do before the job wears the watching out of you. He'd seen Nora set the blanket down. He'd seen the 3 questions. He'd seen her steer Pham toward the answer without leaving a fingerprint on it. And afterward, in the medroom, he asked her about it, in the earnest, clumsy way of a kid who hasn't learned yet that some questions embarrass the person they're aimed at. He asked how she knew. Nora was drawing up a dose and didn't look up. She said the man's mouth was faster than the left side of his face and left it there. Teddy said, "Yeah, but how did you know to listen for that?" And there was a beat where the real answer sat in the room with them, the whole shape of it, the years and the place and the reason her ear worked the way it did. And Nora let the beat pass. She said you listen to enough people you start hearing when one of them is running 2 engines that aren't synced. Then she capped the syringe and told him to go check the man in Bay 5's dressing, which was her way of ending a conversation. And Teddy went because he was learning, but he filed it. That was the thing about Teddy. He was too green to know what he was looking at, and too observant to let it go. And somewhere in him, a small, quiet question had started to grow, the question of who this woman actually was, underneath the flat voice and the corner chair and the ear she kept turned toward the door. Pike, meanwhile, had started keeping a closer eye on Nora, and not in a way that helped anyone. The hip fracture woman had become a small burr under his skin. Not because he'd been wrong exactly. In his framing, the system had simply lacked the right inputs, and the right fix was better inputs, not more nurses freelancing off their feelings. But the case had been discussed. He'd heard his own name attached to it in the version where a nurse caught what the score missed, and that version, true or not, was corrosive to the thing he'd been hired to build. If the staff started believing that the way to be a hero at Northline was to override the tools, then the tools were dead, and everything he'd staked himself on died with them. So he watched her. He pulled her override log. He noted correctly that Nora Halverson bypassed protocol more than any other nurse in the department, and he noted incorrectly that this made her a risk. He did not look at the column next to it, the one that would have told him how those overrides had turned out, because it did not occur to him that the answer to a compliance problem might be found in the outcomes rather than the rate. He was measuring the wrong thing with great precision. It is the specific failure mode of intelligent people who love their instruments. He decided that week that the next time Nora Halverson went around a validated tool, he was going to make it matter. Not a lecture at the wall monitor, something with a record on it. He didn't have to wait long. 9 days after the woman with the hip on a wet Thursday, with the fog pressing flat against the windows, a 41-year-old man named Delroy Kemp walked into the Northline Emergency Department, under his own power, apologizing for wasting everyone's time, holding a bag of frozen peas against a scraped knee. To understand what Nora saw when she looked at Delroy Kemp, you have to go back 8 years to the thing she never talked about. She had been a hospital corpsman in the Navy, which is the rating that gets loaned out to the Marines, because the Marines have no medical people of their own and rely entirely on Navy corpsmen to keep them alive. A corpsman attached to a Marine unit is not a nurse and not a doctor. He or she is the only medicine for miles the person a platoon of infantry turns to when something has gone wrong with a body, and the Marines who depend on that person do not call them by their name. They call them doc. It is the highest thing they have to give, and they give it to a 22-year-old with a bag and a year of training, and no way to know yet whether they'll freeze. Nora didn't freeze. She found that out about herself in a way most people never have to. Her last deployment, she ran a small forward aid station in a compound the unit called Half Moon after the shape of the wall around it. It was not a hospital. It was a room with a table and whatever she could carry, and its job was to keep a wounded Marine alive long enough to reach a real hospital somewhere else. Some nights that job was quiet. Some nights it was the loudest thing in the world. The night that finished her left ear, the compound took indirect fire, and one round landed close enough to the aid station that the pressure of it arrived before the sound. She was leaning over a casualty when it hit her left side toward the wall, and the blast came through the wall and through her. And the last clean thing she ever heard on that side was the start of the noise, cut off halfway, like a record lifted mid-song. After that, there was only the tone, the high, thin, endless wire of it that she would carry for the rest of her life, the sound of a nerve that had been asked for too much and had simply stopped answering. She kept working that night. That was the part nobody would have believed if she'd ever told it, which she never did. Half-deaf ears ringing so hard the world had gone underwater, she kept her hands on the casualty in front of her, because her hands still knew what to do, even when the rest of her had been knocked sideways, and she read that Marine's body through her fingers, because her fingers were the only instrument she had left that the blast hadn't taken. She felt the heat pulling back from his fingertips, and she knew what it meant, and she chased it, and she kept him until the bird came. He lived. She found that out later. She always found out later, and later was always enough. She came home with a coin. The unit had won, the way units do a challenge coin they slapped on a bar to see who'd forgotten theirs and owed the round. Theirs had the half moon of the compound wall stamped on one face. Somebody pressed hers into her hand, at the end, a Marine whose name she still carried, and told her that as long as she had it, she was still one of them wherever she ended up. She'd ended up in a fog-bound town in Oregon, holding people's collarbones at 4 a.m, and the coin was still in her pocket, worn thin at the edge, because her thumb had spent 8 years moving across it whenever a problem needed working. She never told the hospital any of it, not because it hurt. That was what people always assumed about veterans who stayed quiet, that the silence was a wound. Hers wasn't. Her silence was a decision made carefully for a reason she could have defended in a sentence if anyone had ever earned the sentence. She had watched what happened to the ones who led with it. The moment a colleague learned you'd been docked downrange in the real thing, they stopped hearing your clinical judgment as clinical judgment. It became a war story. Every read you made got filtered through the mystique of where you'd been, which sounds like respect and functions like the opposite, because a read that's respected for its origin is a read nobody actually checks. She didn't want to be believed because she'd survived something. She wanted to be believed because she was right, and the only way to be believed for being right was to make sure nobody knew the other thing, so that her calls had to stand on their own 2 feet every single time, with nothing propping them up but the fact of their accuracy. There was a colder reason, too, underneath the clean one. The people who knew what she'd done also knew what it had cost, and they watched for the cost. They waited for the flashback, the shaking hand, the night she'd finally come apart, because the culture had taught them that this was the shape the story took. And Nora refused to be a story with that shape. Her hands did not shake when she worked. They shook sometimes at 3 p.m, in a parking lot for no reason she could name, when the tone in her dead ear climbed for a while, and the memory came up on its own schedule, but never over a patient. Never with a life under them. Over a life, her hands were the steadiest thing in any room, And she was not going to hand that certainty to people who'd only ever seen the wound and would flinch every time she reached for a scalpel, waiting for her to be the thing they'd decided she must secretly be. So she was cold. She was unambitious. She had no story. She sat in the corner with her back to the wall and her right ear to the door and a worn coin in her pocket, and she kept 57 strangers alive years later on a February night, precisely because she had spent a decade making sure not one of them knew she could. That was the woman looking at Delroy Kemp's knee. He was embarrassed to be there. He kept saying it. He'd gone down chasing a soccer ball with his kid on wet asphalt 2 days ago, scraped the knee up, cleaned it out, and now it was sore and a little swollen, and his wife had made him come in because she'd read something online. He apologized for the internet. He apologized for the peas. He was a warm, funny, self-deprecating man who clearly did not want to be a burden, and the triage score agreed with him completely. Superficial abrasion. Mild cellulitis at worst. Antibiotics keep it elevated. Reassess in the morning. He scored low. He scored the way a scraped knee scores. Nora put 2 knuckles against the skin above the wound. The knee itself looked like a scraped knee. Red, a little puffy, a scab forming. But the skin 4 inches above it, up the thigh, where there was no visible injury at all, was doing something the knee wasn't. Was tight in a way that had nothing to do with swelling. She could see hard under her fingers, like there was wood beneath it instead of muscle. And when she pressed and let go, the color came back wrong, and there was a heat coming off it that was not the honest heat of a normal infection. It was too much heat, deep and wide, spreading past the borders of anything the eye could justify. And when she moved her knuckles up another 2 inches past, where any of this should have reached the skin, there had gone the other way. Numb feeling. Cool. As if the body had already started giving up territory it couldn't defend. She'd felt this exact thing once before, on a table at Half Moon, on a Marine, with a wound that looked nothing like the disaster underneath it. Delroy Kemp was rotting from the inside faster than his face knew, and the score in the computer said, reassess in the morning, and morning was going to be a funeral. She straightened up and told him in an ordinary voice, so as not to scare him, that she wanted a doctor to look at his leg right now, and then she went to find Pike. She found Pike at the central station standing in the pale glow of the tracking board, updating the disposition on another patient. He looked comfortable there. That was the thing about Pike at the board. It was where he was most himself, the whole department rendered as rows and colors and countdown timers, a machine he could see all of at once. Nora told him she needed him to look at Bay 7. She told him she thought the man had necrotizing fasciitis in the leg and that it was moving. Pike finished the note he was typing before he turned. Not to be rude. It was just that a note in progress was real to him in a way that a nurse's sentence had to earn its way up to, and the note was already in the system, already scored, already part of the record, whereas what Nora had said was so far just weather. He asked what the patient scored. Nora said she wasn't quoting the score. She was telling him what her hands found. The tissue 4 to 6 inches proximal to the wound was indurated and hot out of proportion, with a rim of anesthesia above it, and the progression felt fast. Pike pulled the chart up on the board while she talked. He read it in about 4 seconds, the way he read everything, and she watched his face settle into the particular calm of a man whose instrument has just told him the opposite of what he's being told by a person. The vitals were stable. The white count was up, but not alarmingly. There was no crepitus documented, no bully, no skin necrosis visible, none of the hard clinical flags the pathway wanted before it would escalate. The imaging hadn't been ordered because nothing in the presentation justified the radiation and the delay. By the book which Pike had helped write, Delroy Kemp was a cellulitis waiting on antibiotics. He said there were no signs of NX fash and told her the sensitivity of pain out of proportion in an anxious patient was poor, which was true, and was also not what she'd said. Nora said she hadn't mentioned pain. She'd said the tissue felt wrong, and the border was climbing, and she'd watched it climb an inch in the time it took her to walk to the desk and back. And if he wanted, she would go mark the current line on the man's thigh with a pen, and they could both come look again in 10 minutes and see where it was. That offer was the most dangerous thing she could have said, and she knew it as it left her because it was falsifiable. It put a clock on the disagreement. And Pike heard it as a challenge to the board rather than a test of the leg, which is exactly the trap that the board sets for the people who love it. He was no longer weighing whether the man had a flesh-eating infection. He was weighing whether a nurse's finger drawn on a thigh was going to be allowed to overrule a validated pathway in his department in front of the tracking screen on his shift. He said no. He said the patient would get antibiotics and admission and reassessment per the pathway, and that if there was clinical change, the pathway would catch it. He said the word pathway 3 times in 90 seconds, and each time it sounded a little less like medicine and a little more like a wall he was standing behind. Nora looked at him for a moment. She understood standing there that this had stopped being about Delroy Kemp somewhere in the last 30 seconds and become about which of them got to be the kind of person the other one had to listen to. Those were different fights. Only one of them had a man dying inside it, and the man inside it did not have 10 minutes to spare, while 2 people who had spent a year and a half not quite fighting finally had the fight. So she stopped talking to Pike. She went back to Bay 7. She checked the border again, and it had moved, and she stopped waiting for permission, the way she had once stopped waiting for permission, on a different night in a different country, because there is a point past which asking is just a way of sharing the blame for a death you could have prevented. She paged the on-call surgeon, directly a woman named Okonkwo, who did not know Nora and had no reason to trust her, and Nora made the trust unnecessary by handing her something she could act on. She said the words, surgical emergency, and she said, suspected necrotizing, soft tissue infection, and she said, the border is advancing, and I marked it, and I can watch it advance. And those are the words that make a surgeon put down her coffee, because a nurse who says them, and is wrong, is a nurse who never says them again. And Okonkwo could hear in Nora's voice that Nora knew that. Okonkwo came down. She put her own hands on the leg. She was quiet for about 4 seconds, which in a surgeon is a scream, and then she was on the phone booking an OR, and she was not asking anyone's permission either. They opened Delroy Kemp 40 minutes later and found the infection had already run the length of the fascial plane in his thigh, a sheet of dead and dying tissue, spreading along the lines of the muscle exactly the way Nora's knuckles had traced it on the surface. Another few hours, and it would have reached the trunk, and once it reaches the trunk, the survival numbers fall off a cliff that no algorithm can climb back up. They took a great deal of his thigh. They saved his leg mostly and his life entirely, and Delroy Kemp went home 3 weeks later to the kid he'd been chasing the soccer ball with on 2 legs, one of them a good deal thinner than the other, and worth every ounce it had lost. Pike learned all of this while Nora was still gowning down outside the OR. And what he did next had nothing to do with Delroy Kemp being alive, and everything to do with what it meant that Nora had been right in a way the board could not absorb. He did not come find her privately. He came out to the main floor where the shift was thick with people, where Teddy Okafor was restocking a cart, and 2 other nurses were charting, and a resident was on the phone, and he told her in the level voice that never rose that she had bypassed a physician's order and a validated pathway and gone directly to a surgical consult without authorization, and that a positive outcome did not change the fact that a department cannot function when its members decide unilaterally which protocols apply to them. There was something running under the level voice that was not about protocols at all, and Nora recognized it because she had heard it before in the mouths of people who had confused their authority with their spine, who could not tell the difference between being challenged and being unmade. She did not argue. She had learned a long time ago that arguing in that moment in front of those people only hands the other person more rope, and she was not in the business of giving Pike rope. She listened until he was done. Then she unclipped her badge and set it on the counter and gathered the few things that were hers, and a security officer she'd shared 100 quiet night shifts with walked her out through the lobby with an expression on his face, like something was being done that he wanted no part of and could not stop. She stood in the parking structure on level 2 next to her car in the cold that came up off the concrete, and she did not cry and she did not shake. She did the thing she had trained herself to do after decisions that could not be taken back, which was to stand still and let the noise in her own head settle before she tried to think, because thinking through the noise only produced more noise. She had been right, and she had been punished for it, and both of those were true at once, and she was old enough to know the world did not always trouble itself to reconcile them. She got in the car. She sat with her hands on the wheel, and down in the town below the fog in a tunnel through Halloran Ridge that Walt Becker had drilled 30 years before, something was about to go very wrong. Nora made it 4 blocks. She was on Fern Street with the heater running and the wipers pushing the fog around when the traffic in front of her stopped moving and didn't start again. Not the ordinary stop of a light, the full settled stillness of a road that is closed somewhere ahead, brake lights stacking up red into the gray for as far as she could see. Then the first siren thin and far off, then a second from a different direction, and a third, and the specific overlapping wail of more emergency vehicles than a town this size sends anywhere for a single ordinary reason. She had the radio on low, and the announcer's voice changed in the way voices change when the person is reading something that just landed in front of them. There had been a collapse in the Route 9 tunnel. A National Guard convoy moving through a passenger bus, ice on the roadway. And then the reports got confused, the way they do in the first 10 minutes, structural failure. A fire vehicle's trapped in the bore, an unknown number of people in a 2-mile tube of concrete under a ridge full of water. Nora did the math the way she always did it, cold and fast, and without wanting to. A convoy, plus a bus, plus fire, plus a confined space, equaled a casualty count that the Northline Emergency Department on a good night fully staffed was not built to hold. And tonight it was not fully staffed, and it was not a good night, and it had 1 fewer experienced hand than it had possessed that morning, because that hand was sitting in a stopped car on Fern Street with no badge. She could have gone home. It would have been easy, and more than easy it would have been. Just. Nobody in that hospital had a claim on her tonight. The institution had walked her out through its own front doors 9 hours ago and made a point of the security escort, and whatever was about to arrive at those doors was in the plainest sense not her problem. She had earned the right to drive home and turn on a light, and let the building she'd been thrown out of solve its own emergency with the people it had decided to keep. She thought about that for exactly as long as it took to see the Humvee. It was 30 yards up the road, canted sideways, where it had died, hazards blinking hood up. A young guardsman in AC US was half under it and half out trying to coax a dead engine. And behind him in the fog were the flashing lights of the thing he was trying to get to and could not. And on his face was the particular helplessness of a person who has been trained to respond, and whose vehicle has decided tonight is the night it quits. He straightened up and looked down the line of stopped cars, scanning the way you scan when you need help, and will take it from anyone still upright. He saw Nora, or he saw her scrubs through the windshield, and her stillness the fact that she was the only driver in the row who was looking toward the tunnel instead of away from it. He came down the line at a run, and she had the window down before he reached it. He told her it was bad, He told her they were pulling people out and there weren't enough hands, and the hospital was already asking for anyone with medical training, any level, to come in. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know about Pike or the badge on the counter or the escort through the lobby. He just saw someone who looked like she knew what she was doing, and he asked her to come. Nora looked at him. She looked past him at the lights in the fog. She thought about the people in that tunnel who had gotten into a bus or into a Humvee that morning with no idea it was the last ordinary thing they'd do, and who had done nothing to her, who had never heard the word pathway, who were not party to anything that had happened on the second floor of Northline General that afternoon. Whatever was between her and that hospital was between her and that hospital. It had nothing to do with the people about to come through its doors, and none of them deserved to pay a cent of it. She put the car in park, where it sat in the middle of a road that wasn't going anywhere anyway, and she got out. She told the guardsman his engine was flooded and to leave it, and then she started walking fast upstream against the stalled traffic and into the fog, half a mile of cold, wet dark, toward the only place she'd spent the last 12 years learning how to be. The Northline Emergency Department, when she came through the ambulance bay doors, did not look like any night she'd worked there. The hallway was full of gurneys in both directions, some against the walls, some abandoned at angles, where a team had simply run out of floor. The tile near the doors was slick with meltwater and road grime, and the pink dilute stain of fluids from lines pulled loose in transport. Monitors chimed from 4 directions, with nobody free to answer them. And under all of it was the sound she had trained a lifetime to hear over everything else. The sound that isn't a sound, the ones who had gone quiet. The patients whose silence meant not calm, but the opposite. The ones whose bodies had stopped spending energy on noise because they were spending all of it on staying. She stood just inside the doors for 3 seconds and did the thing she had learned at Half Moon, which was to read the room as a single organism before she looked at any one part of it. And what she saw was a staff working as hard as human beings can work in the wrong order. There was a resident near the entrance, capable and drowning triaging patients. In the sequence they came through the door, which is the correct instinct in every ordinary emergency, and precisely the wrong one when the number of patients exceeds what the room can treat at once. He was giving the loudest patients the most attention, which felt like compassion and functioned like a leak because the loud ones were loud, because they still had the air to be. And 3 doors down, a man against the wall with a gray cast to his face and a chest that barely moved had not been reached at all. Nora went to the man against the wall first. She got 2 knuckles to his skin, and it told her everything. The heat was pulling in from his edges, retreating toward the core, the tide going out that she'd felt 100 times and could not unfeel. She turned to the nearest nurse, and it was Teddy Okafor, wide-eyed and pale, and holding on by his fingernails, and she told him this man was bleeding out somewhere. They couldn't see that he was in shock, and that the quieter he got, the worse it was, and that he needed blood now, not soon. Teddy moved. He didn't question her, and the fact that he didn't told her something important, that at least part of this staff had already crossed the line, where they would follow whoever sounded like they actually knew badge or no badge. And that was the moment the second life of Nora Halverson began, though nobody in the room knew it, yet least of all as a name, because here was the strangeness at the center of the night. She started running the floor, and she ran it well, and not one person in that hallway knew who she was. They didn't know she'd done this exact work before, in worse conditions with less. They didn't know the flat, quiet nurse from the corner chair had spent 4 years being the only medicine for a platoon of Marines. They saw a suspended nurse with no badge giving orders in a crisis, and some of them followed because the orders kept being right, and some of them hesitated because word had traveled that morning that she'd been walked out, and Nora felt the hesitation. and did not spend a single breath fighting it. She had no interest in convincing anyone of who she was. She was never going to tell them. She was going to let the work say it, or let it go unsaid, and either way she was going to keep moving, because that was the whole architecture of the life she'd built, to be right in the dark and let the rightness be its own quiet argument. She started calling it, "That man, to the OR. Now this one holds 15 minutes. The woman in Bay 2 has a tension pneumothorax building and needs a needle before she needs anything else on that chart. The kid by the window looks stable, and his his pressure has been sliding by small degrees for 6 minutes, and the trend is the tell watch, the trend, not the number." She didn't raise her voice. She'd learned long ago that volume in a crisis is just more noise, and that the thing that cuts through noise is not loudness, but precision. An instruction so specific and so clearly correct that following it is easier than doubting it. One nurse pushed back, asked her not unkindly what her authority was given the morning. Nora didn't answer the question. She pointed at the kid by the window and set his pressure again lower this time, and told the nurse to go check it right now and come back and tell her the number. The nurse went and checked, and came back with a number that was exactly as low as Nora had said it would be, and did not ask about authority again. That was how it dissolved one verifiable call at a time. Authority in a room like this was never a badge or a title. It was the accumulating weight of decisions that turned out to matter, and Nora had been accumulating that weight her whole life in silence, waiting for no one. She had no idea yet that across the department, being wheeled in from the far end of the convoy, was a National Guard sergeant with a challenge coin of his own in his pocket, and that, in a little while, he was going to look up from a gurney and see her face, and change everything she had spent 12 years keeping hidden. Pike appeared at the department entrance about half an hour after Nora had walked back in. He'd been upstairs when the first wave hit, and he came down into a scene he did not recognize and could not immediately parse. And the first clear thing his eyes landed on was Nora Halverson, standing in the middle of the floor, calm in a way that did not belong to a person he had personally escorted out of the building that afternoon, directing the flow of patients and staff like she'd been built for exactly this and nothing else. His face moved through several things fast: recognition, disbelief, and then something older and more familiar reasserting itself, the reflex of a man reaching for the authority he understood, because the situation in front of him had stopped making sense any other way. He started toward her. He was maybe 4 steps in when a guardsman being walked down the hall between 2 orderlies lifted his head and saw her. The sergeant was young, 26 at most, with a pressure dressing wrapped around a forearm that had already soaked through dark, and he was leaning most of his weight on the 2 people holding him up. But when he saw Nora's face, he straightened. Not all the way. His body wouldn't let him. But enough that both orderlies felt it and looked at him, and then followed his eyes to the woman in the middle of the room, and in the pocket of his ACUs, when he'd straightened, a coin had shifted and dropped and rolled a few inches across the wet tile, and stopped brass catching the light. Nora's eyes went to it, the way yours go to your own name spoken in a crowd before you've decided to look. She knew the weight of it from across the floor. She knew the sound it made on tile. And the sergeant, following her gaze down to his own coin and then back up to her face, put the 2 things together in the space of one breath and said a word that was not her name and was more than her name. He said Half Moon, not a question. The way you say a thing you'd been told about and had stopped believing was real. Somewhere in this kid's chain in the long oral history that units carry, there was a story about a forward aid station called Half Moon, and the corpsman who'd run it, half deaf through a night that should have killed everyone in it. And he had grown up on that story, the way kids grow up on stories, and he had just watched it stand up in the middle of a hospital and start saving people. and his body had recognized it before his mind gave permission. The hallway did not go silent all at once. It went quiet in a wave starting from the sergeant and spreading outward as people caught the word and felt the weight land on it, without understanding yet what the weight was. Pike stopped walking. The drowning resident looked up from his clipboard. Teddy Okafor, running blood into the gray-faced man against the wall, turned his head toward the sound, without letting go of the line, and something crossed his face that was the answer to a question he'd been carrying since the night he watched her set a blanket down and diagnose a stroke off a single word. The kid finally had the shape of who she was, and the shape was larger than anything he'd guessed. Nobody spoke into the quiet. The sergeant's one word had done the work of a full biography more efficiently than any explanation could have. The woman in the center of their emergency department, the flat, quiet nurse Pike had walked out that morning as a compliance problem had apparently been somewhere far past anything they'd imagined, and had apparently been someone the people who'd been there spoke of the way you speak of the person who carried you out. Nora bent unhurried and picked the coin up off the tile and crossed to the sergeant and pressed it back into his hand and closed his fingers over it. And she said one thing to him, low, just for him. She told him to keep his arm above his heart and stop trying to stand at attention because she needed him alive more than she needed him respectful. It was not a speech. It was the truest thing she had said out loud in a hospital in 12 years, and it landed like an order, because it was one. Then she straightened and turned back to the room, and the room was different now, and she used it. She stopped softening the calls. She stopped routing decisions through residents to protect their credit. There was no time left for the elaborate humility she'd built her whole career out of, and for one night, she set it down and simply ran the floor as the thing she actually was, and the floor moved for her because it finally believed what it was looking at. Pike did not come the rest of the way. He stood where he'd stopped, and for the first time all day, he had nothing prepared to say. He was still by every measure the building recognized the senior physician in the room. He still outranked her, out-titled her, out-authorized her on every line of every org chart Northline kept. But the room had rearranged itself around a different axis. In the last 30 seconds, one his charts had no column for, and he was sharp enough, whatever else he was, to know it. He didn't leave, and didn't interfere. After a moment, he moved to the side wall and made himself useful in the smallest available way, taking supply requests, coordinating with the ORs upstairs, doing real work quietly and without announcing it. It was the least a man could do, and still be doing something, and the staff clocked it. And nobody said a word, because there was nothing that needed saying, that the day hadn't already said louder. The worst hour was still ahead. The first wave had been survivable because Nora had caught the department before it collapsed and turned it. But the casualties kept coming, and the staff's reserves ran down, and the failures moved around and found new places to happen. An OR running 3 cases hit a wall when 2 turned worse than the scans promised. A restock that should have happened an hour earlier hadn't. A crash cart's defibrillator died mid-code, and a nurse burned 4 minutes. She didn't have finding another. Teddy Okafor was the one who broke, and Nora saw it coming before it arrived. He'd been holding himself together on pure will, and will has a ceiling, and Teddy hit his standing over a patient who needed a line restarted and a cart checked, and a screaming family member walked out all at once. He started to come apart, not quietly, the sudden, uncontrolled way a body overrides a mind that's asked too much of it for too long. Nora crossed to him in 4 steps. She didn't touch his shoulder, and she didn't tell him it would be okay, because neither of those was what the moment could use. She put herself directly in his line of sight, and spoke in a voice that had no unkindness in it, and no room in it either. She told him she needed his hands on the line in Bay 6. She told him he was allowed to fall completely apart the second this was over, and that she would sit on the floor with him while he did it for as long as it took. But that Bay 6 was now, and Bay 6 could not wait. Teddy took one ragged breath and nodded and went to Bay 6, and his hands worked. And then, near 2 in the morning, the choice came. 2 patients arrived in the same load from the deepest part of the tunnel, the part that had taken longest to reach, and both were critical in ways that immediately closed off every comfortable option. One was the National Guard sergeant's squad mate, a man in his 30s with a crushed chest that had stopped his lungs from doing their own work. The other was a 16-year-old boy who'd been on the bus with a head injury that was taking his consciousness away from him in steps each step lower than the last. There was 1 ventilator free in the department. 1. And 2 people who would die without it inside the hour. Everyone who understood the situation assumed the vent would go to the soldier. He was younger by 15 years, than the tunnel, older than the boy. Stronger, a guardsman, one of theirs, in the specific way tonight had made the guard theirs. The narrative pointed one direction so hard it barely felt like a choice. Nora put her hands on both of them. She read what the tunnel had done to the sergeant's squad mate, and she read what it had done to the boy, and she read the thing under the surface that the monitors were slow to say, and she made the call the machines couldn't. She gave the ventilator to the 16-year-old. She directed the team on the soldier toward a bridge, a stopgap that bought time at the cost of certainty, and she did it, knowing that if she was wrong, the boy would live, and the soldier would not, and she would carry it, and she made it anyway, because the boy's brain was still salvageable, and the soldier had a door open that the boy did not. And someone in that room had to be able to see the door, and the person who understood it first and best was the crushed-chested soldier himself, who was still conscious enough to follow what she'd chosen, and who lifted 2 fingers off the gurney at her, the smallest possible salute, because he had been trained in exactly the kind of triage that hurts, and he knew a correct call when it went against him, and he wanted her to know that he knew. Nobody argued. By then, nobody in that room would have. The bridge held. Walt Becker's BiPAP was part of. Why, though, Nora wouldn't learn that piece until later, the old tunnel man in the hallway pulling the mask off his own failing lungs and pressing it at a passing tech and saying, "Give it to somebody who's got more time left than me," and then putting a demolition man's hands that had held drills steady over seams of killing rock for 40 years, flat against a stranger's bleeding side and holding pressure until the shaking almost took him. He bought minutes. The minutes bought the soldier. The whole night was made of people buying each other minutes, and at the center of it, spending them right, was a woman nobody had known the name of until a coin hit the floor. The last patient stabilized at 1:26 in the morning. Nora knew the exact time because she'd been watching the clock over Bay 3 for the last 20 minutes, not out of impatience, but because time was the one thing in a mass casualty event that never stopped counting right up until the moment it finally didn't. When the monitor over the 16-year-old held a clean rhythm for 4 minutes straight, she let herself stop moving for the first time since she'd come through the doors. She found a stretch of wall by the supply corridor and put her back against it, the way she always put her back against things, and let her hands hang at her sides. The scrubs she'd pulled on almost 24 hours earlier were stiff in places where things had dried. There was a bruise coming up along her left forearm where a cart had caught her sometime in the second wave, and she hadn't felt it happen, and she felt it now. That was how it always went. The body kept a careful ledger of everything it had been put through and presented the whole bill only after the emergency let go of you. Around her, the department was settling into the specific quiet that comes after sustained crisis, which is not the quiet of a calm night, but the quiet of people who have gone past what they believed was their limit and come out the other side, not sure yet what they feel, or whether feeling is even available to them. Teddy Okafor was on the floor near Bay 6, with his knees pulled up, staring at nothing. 2 residents had found chairs, and sat with their elbows on their knees, not talking. The attending from the 2nd OR leaned against the station with his eyes shut, still gowned. Director Yvonne Serrano arrived at 1:55. She'd been across the county when the call reached her, and had driven straight in through the fog without stopping. She came through the main doors and walked past the overflow area, where patients were still being watched, past the family room, where people sat in the particular agony of not yet knowing, and through into the hallway, where all of it had happened. She stopped just inside and looked. The dried fluid on the tile, the gurneys along both walls, the staff present and accounted for wearing the faces of people who'd run much farther than they'd ever trained to run. 57 patients alive. She'd been told the number on the phone. Standing in the room where the number had been earned was a different thing than being told it. She walked the length of the hall slowly, and when she reached the center, she turned to the room and asked who had run this. She wasn't asking for a report. Her voice had the quality of a woman who already understood something significant had happened in this room and needed the human answer before she could deal with the institutional one. For 11 seconds, nobody said anything, not because the answer was complicated, because saying it out loud meant carrying everything that came attached to it. Everyone in that hallway knew the answer, and the knowing sat heavy in a way that plain facts usually don't. And the person who broke the silence was Roland Pike. Nobody expected it. Least of all Nora. He stood by the side wall where he'd spent the last hours making himself quietly useful, and he looked at Serrano, and he said it was Nora Halverson. He said she was the nurse he had suspended that morning. He didn't soften it, or explain it, or wrap it in the context that might have protected him. He gave it plain, the whole shape of it, his own name folded inside it, where it couldn't be pulled out. And in doing that, he did the one thing left to him that could still count for something, which was to tell the truth in front of witnesses, when a lie would have cost him nothing. Serrano crossed the department to where Nora stood against the wall. She took her in the dried blood on the scrubs, the bruise, the face that was neither triumphant nor bitter, only steady, the face of someone who had done what needed doing, and was waiting without much investment to see what came next. Serrano asked her why she had come back. Nora considered it the way it deserved. Then she said the people in that tunnel hadn't done anything to her. Whatever had happened that morning was between her and the hospital, and it had nothing to do with them, and they were the only ones who'd have paid for it. So she came back. The rest of it could keep. Serrano was quiet a moment. She looked at the floor between them, and then back up. And something shifted in her face, the way it shifts in a person who's just heard something simple that makes a complicated thing suddenly clear. She'd spent 22 years running hospitals, 22 years managing the friction between the people who held authority and the people who held the actual competence. And the cases where those two came apart were the ones that cost the most and stayed longest. She was looking at one of them, and she knew almost exactly what it had nearly cost down to the count of 57. The review that followed over the coming weeks was not comfortable for anyone. Pike kept his position. What he lost was harder to get back than a title, the unquestioned deference of the people around him, the thing he'd mistaken for respect for 18 months. The investigation surfaced a pattern: experienced nurses whose reads had been dismissed without any real engagement, because the reads hadn't come with a score attached, and the administration could not treat a pattern as a pile of unrelated accidents. New protocols got drafted, imperfect the way all protocols are, but built now with a line in them for the thing a validated tool can't measure a channel for the hand that knows before the screen does. It was not everything. It was more than there had been. Pike never apologized to Nora in words, not in those first weeks. But months later, in a hallway, neither of them had planned to be in. At the same time, he stopped, and he told her he'd gone back and read the Kemp case all the way through the imaging and the operative note and the margins they'd had to take, and that he understood now what she'd felt under her hands that night and why she hadn't been willing to wait. He didn't call it an apology. He framed it as finding a thing the record supported, which was very likely the most honest form of accountability the man had in him. Nora took it for what it was. She'd stopped needing it to be more a long time ago. The morning after the tunnel, before any of the reviews or the hallway conversations, she went back to the second level of the parking structure to get her car, which was still sitting where she'd abandoned it on Fern Street, actually, and had been towed, and that took most of a morning to sort out. And she sorted it out without drama, because that, too, was just a thing that needed doing. When she came back into the department, Teddy Okafor was waiting by the lockers with her badge in both hands. He held it out and didn't say anything, because he'd finally learned that some moments are made smaller by words. And Nora took it the same way without ceremony and clipped it back to her scrubs. He did ask her one thing quietly, the question he'd carried since the blanket and the stroke. He asked if it was true, the story, Half Moon, all of it. Nora looked at him for a second. Then she told him that what was true was that a man in Bay 6 had needed his hands last night, and his hands had been good, and that this was the only part of any of it that had ever mattered to her. And Teddy understood that he had just been given both an answer and the reason she would never give him a fuller one, and he let it go, and he was better at the job forever after for having learned how. The morning shift was coming in. The night staff was giving handoffs at the station. The monitors were doing what monitors do. Somewhere down the hall, a family was getting news that would reshape the rest of their lives, and somewhere else, a 16-year-old was waking up in a bed he had no business having reached. The Northline Emergency Department was running the way it always ran, imperfectly and necessarily, and Nora Halverson was in it, not as a symbol of anything, not as a lesson anyone had learned overnight, just a nurse who had shown up the way she showed up every day, ready to do the work for whoever needed it, with a coin worn thin in her right hip pocket and one ear turned toward the door. There's something in Nora's story that stays with you after it's over. The idea that the realest kind of skill doesn't announce itself. It comes in quiet, does the thing that has to be done, and asks for nothing back. Most of us will never stand in a hallway full of gurneys and decide who gets the last ventilator. But nearly all of us know what it is to be waved off by someone who had the authority and not the wisdom, or to watch the person with less power and more truth get moved to the side. Nora's answer to that wasn't a speech. It was a decision to walk back through the door anyway, because the people who needed her had no part in what had been done to her. If that landed with you tonight, subscribe so the next one finds you. And tell me in the comments if you'd have walked back through those doors. I'm not sure everyone would.